small and medium enterprises. So again, like the financial guarantee that they could provide is not sufficient at the bank standards in some level. And also basically banks, because they see that the Indo-Pakistan trade volumes are so low, so they sometimes don't find it like how they come up with say, trade financing solution. But if the trade financing solution is there, then trade will automatically spread. So this is somehow is a chicken and egg problem, and see that what chases what. So this is something that we need to understand, and we need to basically see. So like coming back to, there are a lot of things that, but so I'll just come to this last slide of recommendation. So what we can do is basically we first need to make our frontline managers more trained, and they should know what is actually needed, and they know more of the policies, not just domestic policies, but the policies across the border, so that basically they facilitate the trade. They just make more option. And also the custom officers and where basically they need to see this guarantees and financial guarantees. Though we need to create the mindset for the trade that okay, your job is to facilitate trade, not to restrict trade, and this basically helps. And then there is a lot of like if we can have this 24 hours banking solutions for these, like to operationalize these formal financing modes, and then that would be basically, that's how we basically capitalize on the like proximities and the gains in proximities, and then we increase representatives. And there is one very strong in Karachi. We had this propose this idea of having the representative office of the commercial banks. If we do not have, because of these regulatory concerns and issues, if we are not able to get all those like full-fledged banking branches for some reason in across the border, then we should rather come up as a temporary solution till that time the representative office of these banks, so that they basically facilitate trades. And also we should consider like how to make this trade in local currencies happen in the, and if this thing can happen, then we basically we can materialize a lot of this trade potential. So thank you very much. And I think I took a little more time, but
no problem. Right. Come, thank you. You did very well. You only denied me the privilege of telling my friend Indranath Mukherjee that I was most indulgent to him. I could not. Thank you very much. I am particularly impressed by your inclusion of political risks and what you call the trust deficit. I am almost cynical, fond of saying again and again that if you have to fix economic cooperation in this region, you have to fix political problems of this region in terms of interstate relations. And if we can't do that, I hope we will have some discussion on this aspect. May I now request Rahul Mediratta, who is a PhD scholar at Northwest University in Chicago. But the most interesting aspect is that he focuses on formal as well as informal politics in economics. And let's see what he has to say.
Okay. So thanks for having me. So I'll just share briefly the origins of this research, because it's not what I do predominantly. So I'm a PhD candidate in political science, and the core of what I do is on the role of indirect trade, whatever you want to label that, smuggling, informal trade, in relation to the normalization of trade in this region. And so, and then what the implications of this process could be for security in the region. So in the process of basically being a user of a lot of content that covers that issue area, I read the news a lot, and I have a Google tool that sends me the top 10 updates on whatever contains the terms India and Pakistan every day, for example. So something that struck me was that when I read an article, like any of us, for example, if I read an article in LiveMint, then I'll learn what else LiveMint reported on. So I was realizing that I never read the Times of India, because the Times of India never reports on India-Pakistan trade. And so that prompted me to think about whether there was a puzzle here about informational barriers in the form of media representation of a given issue towards normalization of India-Pakistan trade. So So that basically prompted me to articulate this puzzle, whether trade is actually captured in media coverage on India-Pakistan relations. So we know for the past 2 decades there have been numerous activities related to India-Pakistan trade, and I wanted to know, do these appear in the news? So the general criticism or critique of media coverage on India-Pakistan is there is a preoccupation on the security realm. So there are examples in the literature I've cited here. I won't elaborate for the sake of time, but you should read those if you're curious. And the general conclusion from these reports is that there is a negative bias in reporting. Basically, in a given event, there's a greater weight given to negative quotes rather than positive quotes, for example, from officials. So then that led me at least to think whether underreporting on trade-related activity can itself be a barrier to trade normalization. So this is kind of a mechanism I imagined, which I think is plausible. So underreporting may imply lack of popular awareness on a given issue. And so that can limit the feasibility of governments to actually pursue trade normalization, or perhaps limit the extent to which the public actually pressure government to carry that process forward. And so in communication studies scholarship, the term for such a mechanism is basically called agenda setting, the affect of media on public opinion. So in that sense, underreporting on trade can possibly serve as an informational barrier to trade normalization. So here are 2 quotes I want to share from scholars of this region from different sectors. So the first, Dr. Arvind Gupta from IDSA, from the defense sector, says in a recent comment this year that adversarial and negative perceptions come in the way of regional cooperation and integration. Hyperactive 24/7 media play a role in perpetuating cynicism. A cooperative approach to resolving regional issues remains elusive, but this need not be so. An effort to forge positive perceptions about each other must be made. So basically a link is being argued here between media representation and de-escalation of a conflict. Yes?
The data source for this is what?
Sure. It's on the website of IDSA, and it was in a speech given at the 7th South Asia Conference this year.
The overall impression, are you looking at media reports for both countries or just for...
When you come to the questions later on.
No, just a clarification. It's not a...
Can you wait for the clarification before you jump into the presentation?
This is a quantitative piece, not qualitative. Yeah. So a second quote from Dr. Pratap Bhanumeta at CPR in the Indian Express, again this year, says that even simple things like trade and investment involve large assumptions about what you will let people do, how you will let them travel, how much presumed trust you repose in them, and so forth. Pragmatism is not an alternative to a stuck discourse on norms. It requires an even more radical change. So I'll just skip to the last sentence that I've italicized. They have to make reference to a larger story towards which we are driving. So the sense that attempting trade normalization in a vacuum, kind of divorced from its broader political context, may not lead successful results. So I'll skip this quote. So why is underreporting relevant to India-Pakistan trade right now? So there's been signals from Pakistan that MFN could be granted, but if that happened, it would happen during the upcoming elections. Now, yes, last week after the SARC conference, NDMA was said, it was agreed that NDMA would be pursued, so whatever nomenclature you prefer, I'm indifferent. And members of Pakistan industry have urged that MFN should be granted regardless of the electoral outcome in India. So a question I think is worth asking is, will voters in this country pressure the next government to carry forward those initiatives, or will they possibly respond positively to such initiatives? So first, let's get a sense of what do we mean by barriers to trade. So broadly speaking, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And I've constructed a table that I think is useful for a layperson's audience in terms of what are tariffs versus non-tariff barriers. And so broadly, tariff barriers are basically taxes. So tariffs, examples include duties, pair of tariffs, examples include countervailing duties. Now, non-tariff barriers I suggest we could think of them as being more tangible versus less tangible. And the more tangible ones are the ones that we talk about here more. And I think that's because the policy implications are more obvious, and the role of government in responding to those is also more obvious. So for example, legal non-tariff barriers include licenses, quotas, restrictions on visa, and there are numerous examples from the Indo-Pakistani context, and I've listed these on the last column. Structurally, we hear about barriers barriers towards actually transporting trade by rail, by road, by sea, and so on and so forth. Financially, there are barriers to do with currency exchange, bank branches. So some less tangible non-tariff barriers, I've identified at least two. One could be cultural. So are there certain norms and taboos that actually inhibit trade? Okay. And then there's some informational non-tariff barriers. So the ones we hear about more are like, what are some protocols, for example, to actually set up a joint venture, which is a conversation I had with Mr. Sehgal when I interviewed him at PyTex last month. But then beyond the business community, what are some informational barriers in society? Are they to do, as I said, a preoccupation in the media with security and thereby excluding coverage on trade or non-security areas? So here's a baseline. Basically, in the last 2 decades, there have been 3 periods when there's been a huge concentration of activity related to trade between India and Pakistan. The late 90s, the mid 2000s, and the early 2010s. And so the basic pattern is there's a huge hype of activity, and then there's some political conflict, and then that activity kind of cuts down. So in this first period, it was related to Kargil War in '99. Second period, it was 2008 Mumbai attacks. And now the third kind of big period of activity is right now in the early 2010s. So what I wanted to get a sense of is the news capturing this activity over time? So I did a content analysis of 4 English dailies. So one is a broad daily, Times of India. 2 are narrow economic dailies, so Economic Times, Business Standard. And then the 4th is also an economic daily, but it's international, it's the Wall Street Journal. So using these 2 databases, I conduct keyword searches, 3 keyword searches for the past 2 decades. India, India and Pakistan, and then India and Pakistan and trade. So here are some results. First, we see that in terms of face validity, Times of India generates the largest results for all India searches, which makes sense. It's the biggest newspaper that covers this country. Now, India and Pakistan, Economic Times Business Standard has more results than Economic Times for India, but as this goes over time, Economic Times and Wall Street Journal become roughly equal, which is a function of the fact that the Wall Street Journal has a larger circulation than Economic Times. And then Business Standard ranks the last for all keyword searches because it has the smallest circulation. So this first table shows us what proportion of content that contains the keyword India also contains the keyword India and Pakistan and trade. So just a few more minutes? There are no minutes left. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is the interesting graph. Basically, what you find is that the 3 economic journals that I analyzed, Business Standard, Wall Street Journal, and Economic Times, they exhibit these crazy waves over time, and they move in tandem with one another. And the waves actually occur during the very periods that I highlighted as having the highest concentrations of trade-related activity. Times of India, by contrast, exhibits this relatively flat line. So basically, if you're using the Times of India, you're not getting a narrative that you would get from these other economic journals. So that was like a superficial analysis of the difference between these lines. But you can quantify this. And so basically using what's called a coefficient of variation, I've identified the periods when the Times of India is totally divorced from the kind of reporting that the other 3 journals are doing on India-Pakistan trade. And the most significant period is in the last 4 years, where you see that the size of in the overall column, the number is the largest. I can't break it down right now because of time. But basically, it seems that Times of India all of a sudden wakes up to this activity. But if you go back to 2009, 2013, you see that beginning in 2009, Times of India actually begins reporting on this topic area even less relative to all 3 other papers that actually jump up. That's what the size of that number is. So some concluding remarks are that on the one hand, even though Times of India is not an economic journal, so it shouldn't have as much content on trade as an economic journal, at least the dynamism of that coverage should be mimicked over time, would be one argument. And secondly, since the implications of this process are not really economic, they're more in the realm of diplomacy and security, then arguably the Times of India, which reports on these mainstream topics, should be picking up the story. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Well, media as a trade barrier, very interesting dimension. I hope there would be questions whether the Pakistani media also needs to and how critical media is as a barrier. If media started reporting positively, do we hope that there would be change actually in the content or flow of trade between the two countries? Well, this completes our panel list of presenters. We have now two discussants or commentators. Professor Das is first on my list. Very well known scholar of ICRIA, has even represented Government of India in some of the studies and discussions, and a prolific writer. Two of his books are very relevant, already listed here: Regional Trade and Economic Integration and Perspectives on Rule of Origin. Will you kindly make your comments save between 5 to 7 minutes at the most?
Thank you, Professor Muni, for your very generous and kind words. Let me begin by thanking ICRIA for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important process, and heartiest congratulations on a process which is so very relevant for not only for India and Pakistan, but for various reasons, perhaps for the region as well as for the global economies. And especially Nisha, I mean, we must compliment her for sustaining. You know, many times something is initiated, but it is not sustained. And that is where, you know, barriers to trade need to be set in a proper perspective. I keep telling my policymakers also, and as much as to our counterparts in Pakistan, that at least we are talking today about trade, and therefore the barriers to trade are getting repeated, and they are on the fore to be addressed. And the very fact that we are repeating it again and again, I am very sure that the way progress has been achieved in terms of trade integration between India and Pakistan in recent times, especially since 2010-11, I am very sure that many of the issues and very relevant papers that have been presented here would be addressed. We need to see barriers to trade in a relative context. I keep saying that if two trains are moving in the same direction, and they are moving at 100 kilometers per hour speed, you would feel that the other train is not moving at all because of you know, the relative speed. But even if you are moving at 50 kilometers per hour and the other train is moving in the opposite direction, again at 50 kilometers per hour, you will feel, you know, double the speed. You know, so this is the you know, context of addressing barriers to trade. We should understand what kind of context in which India and Pakistan are interacting and trying to resolve trade issues, and barriers to trade, where mindset also is a major barrier in many